In the 1960s and 1970s, California government was viewed as one of the, quote, finest in the world, unquote, because of its ability to tackle big issues in a deliberative, thoughtful, and productive way. Polls over the last couple of decades, however, have reported generally low approval ratings of state government, with dissatisfaction among all voters, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. As a result, there's been a rise in the use of the initiative process to fix what ails California government, resulting in even more dysfunction and more dissatisfaction. This led The Economist magazine to call California, quote, a failed state politically, unquote. How do we fix California government without making matters worse? Our guest is Mark Paul, co-author of California Crackup, How Reform Broke the Golden State and How We Can Fix It, that one reviewer described as, quote, a comprehensive and persuasive analysis of California's dysfunctional governmental system, unquote. Reforming state government. First, do no harm.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Leon Panetta once quipped that it might be easier to find Osama bin Laden than it is to fix California. Well, we found Osama bin Laden. Can we fix California? Our guest is someone who thinks we can. He is Mark Paul, co-author of California Crackup, How Reform Broke the Golden State and How We Can Fix It. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, you outline in your book 5 waves of constitutional change that California has experienced since it became a state. What are they and why are they relevant to us today?
Well, California has a government that's a result of a series of incremental changes, often silver bullets of reform that we've enacted over our history. We have always been a people in a hurry, more interested in getting rich than governing ourselves well. And so, the first wave of reform is when the California wrote its first constitution in Monterey back during the gold rush before California became a state. Those people who wrote the Constitution were most of them gold miners. They were in a hurry to get back to the gold fields, and so they copied most of the Constitution of the state of Iowa because it was short and most recently passed. But all they did is they left out the parts about how to finance government.
Oh, that little part.
That little part.
Now, I think I read in your book that you said that they wanted a break for lunch, so they wanted to get it over as quickly as possible.
Well, that was at the second Constitutional Convention, which is 1879, where a Constitutional Convention was held in Sacramento. They sat for several months, and they got tired. They'd run out of money. They wanted to go home, and so they finished the Constitution by approving it without ever having read it through an entire time.
So very thoughtful and deliberative process.
Very thoughtful and deliberative. That's the California way.
Okay. You say that some of these revisions that have occurred over time are generally driven by, quote, contradictory impulses. What are they?
Well, some of the, for instance, take the example of Proposition 13, which was a major shift in government in California passed in 1978. It was driven by the desire to cut property taxes in California and reduce the size of government. But one of the things that Proposition 13 did was it took power away from local government, because local governments can no longer had any control over their own tax levels, and moved the power to Sacramento. So in the name of smaller government, it actually centralized power in the state.
So it's kind of a he who has the gold makes the rules?
That is how California operates, how all governments operate. And Prop 13 gave the legislature more responsibility to govern the state, but at the same time, Prop 13 required a 2/3 vote for the legislature to pass taxes. So at the same time it gave the legislature more responsibility, it made it harder for the legislature to act.
It's kind of you're talking about contending forces of the professional government versus more power to quote-unquote amateurs through the initiative process. Is that one of the things you're talking about?
Well, that's one of them. When the initiative was created 100 years ago, one of the ways, which was an effort to let ordinary people make laws, one of the ways that we use those as Californians, those initiative powers, to create a whole series of boards and commissions that have made California government ever more elaborate and difficult to understand.
You know, Governor Brown recently explained that, quote, California has confounded its critics. 2 years ago, they thought we were writing our obituary. Well, it didn't happen. California is back. Its budget is balanced, and we are on the move, unquote. So, is he right? Has California government finally begun to function more properly?
Well, we've certainly made a big progress on balancing the budget in California, which has been a major problem for the last decade, and that's a result partly of cuts in spending that government has made in the last 5 years. It's the Prop 30, which raised taxes, and then the economic recovery, has helped bring back revenue. So, but the problems that created the crisis in the last decade, the contradictions in our government haven't gone away, and they'll probably pop up again in the future.
Okay, well, when we come back, we'll discuss the California legislature. Is it better than advertised, or is it as bad as critics charge? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. 30 years ago, the California legislature was considered the nation's finest and one of the best in the entire world. More recently, however, many political observers have lamented the fact that the California legislature seems incapable of addressing the state's most pressing problems. So, what can be done to make the legislature more representative, more accountable, and more deliberative? We're talking with Mark Paul, co-author of California Crackup, How Reform Broke the Golden State and How We Can Fix It. Recently, there are some changes on how we elect legislators. They had created a Citizens Redistricting Commission, they have a top 2 primary system, and they're now letting legislators serve up to 12 years in one house. So the question is, will those changes make the legislature more responsive, more accountable, and more deliberative?
Well, I think certainly that I think the change in term limits, allowing people to spend up to, instead of only 6 years in the Assembly, is up to 12, will certainly help the institutional knowledge and the policy expertise of the legislature. You know, California is by far the most complex human society on the face of the earth. It's got a complex economy. There's nobody, you know, no matter how talented, that can master the range of things the legislators need to master in just 6 years. So I think we will see over time, if the terms, people spend more time in one house, that will help some of the quality of policy making in the House. I think on the other things, the other 2 changes, the jury, you know, it'll take some time to know for sure. The new redistricting commission has created districts that are slightly more competitive than, you know, we have more competitive elections than we had under the prior reapportionment, but not many, and we're not going to have many because of where Californians, the way we sort ourselves into red and blue. And the primary reform, I think, is the early evidence is that the biggest effect will be give more power to big money in California.
Mm-hmm. What about some other changes being floated out there? One was floated last year by Shannon Grove, a Republican out of Bakersfield, who wanted us to return to the part-time legislatures. You know, we changed that in 1966 from part-time to full-time. Would that make the legislative process better or worse, in your opinion?
I think the evidence is that it would make it worse. You know, people complain about the legislature in California, but there is a recent study that looked at how responsive the American states are to the policy views of their electorates, and it turns out, lo and behold, that no state is better than California at translating the policy views of its citizens into state policy. We are the best in the country, and the political scientists Jeffrey Lack, and Justin Phillips of Columbia University, who did this study, concluded in their analyses that the thing that is most responsible that makes states responsive to their voters is the professionalization of their legislature, and term limits are the 2 most important factors.
Well, thank you for the segue. Well, the ongoing debate on term limits. Supporters say, listen, it elects a citizen legislator that's more responsive to the people's needs and wishes. Opponents say it weakens the legislature because they lose expertise and oversight ability, and it strengthens the influence of lobbyists and bureaucrats. What do you think?
Well, I think the evidence is that there needs to be a balance. And I think in the first term limits law that was passed in 1990, limiting people to only 6 years in the Assembly or 8 in the Senate was too restrictive. I think, but it did accomplish one important thing, which is the legislature was transformed. The legislature today, as a result of term limits, in its ethnic makeup and its gender makeup, looks much more like the California than the one prior one. So I'm hoping that we have the balance right here. But but keeping a full-time professional legislature, the evidence seems to be that that's very important.
Well, let's talk about the size of the legislature. It's 120 members. That was established in 1879, and we were less than 1 million people.
Right.
We're now approaching 38 million people, yet we have the legislature that's the exact same size. The Economist magazine recently called the size of the California legislature, quote, comically small, unquote. And it noted that a typical California legislator represents 3 times as many people as his counterpart in New York or Illinois. So while it seems politically counterintuitive, what about increasing the number of legislators?
Well, Joe Matthews and I, in our book, we propose creating a larger legislature so we can have smaller legislative districts, which would have several benefits. I mean, one, it would bring people who are elected closer to the people. It's very hard a senator in California represents 1 million people. You know, not many people can know their senator in California because of that. In other states, you know, the typical district in the rest of the country is about 1/10 the size of California districts.
Well, let me ask you about this bicameral legislature that we have. We know we've got an upper house and a lower house, but at the federal level, the upper house is by states and the lower house is by population. In California, they're both by population. So the first question is, why do we need 2 houses that basically do the same thing? And second, if not, would a unicameral one house make more sense?
I think so. The movement around the world is toward unicameral legislatures. If we had a unicameral legislature, we could make it bigger, have more members, and be more representative. And right now, I mean, the 2 houses serve mostly as to create dark corners for people to strangle, lobbyists to strangle bills, or to do mischief. Better to have one. It's easier for people to keep track of it.
Okay. Well, when we come back, we'll discuss whether turning to the initiative process due to frustration with the perceived legislative inaction has served California and its voters. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Mark Paul, co-author of California Crackup, How Reform Broke the Golden State and How We Can Fix It. Well, a couple of years ago, The Economist magazine wrote a scathing special report on the political process in California, describing it as, quote, an experiment in extreme democracy gone wrong, unquote. They were particularly critical of California's initiative and proposition process. But the initiative and proposition process is not unique to California. Is there something inherently flawed about the way we do it here in California?
Well, we're different in two important ways. California's process is the most inflexible of any in the country and even around the world. It's inflexible on the front end. When you go out and collect signatures for a ballot measure and submit them, the sponsor loses all control over the measure. In other states, the sponsor can do what the initiative implies. He can initiate, take the measure to the legislature and say, listen, the people are interested in doing something like this. Can't we do something? Can't we cut a deal? And in fact, they can do that. In California, you can't do that. Once you've qualified, you're stuck. Even if the measure is flawed, you find mistakes.
There was a recent proposition on the ballot to change the Senate districts that Republicans put up.
Referendum.
They decided not to go forward on that, but it still was on the ballot.
That's right, and and there was even there have been a couple other examples. Back in 2004, the cities qualified something for the ballot, then got a better deal from Arnold Schwarzenegger and the legislature, and end up campaigning against their own measure.
That's very confusing to the voters, I'm sure.
But the more important inflexibility is on the back end, which is that California is the only place in the world where a law passed by the initiative, can't subsequently be changed by the legislature, even as conditions change down the road. It has to go back to the voters, which is why we're still voting on chiropractic regulation that was set up in the 1920s.
You know, that brings up a good point, and that is the whole issue of ballot box budgeting, where through initiative of the proposition process, we mandate a certain amount of spending. Education is a very good example of that, and then we lock in those amounts forever. Has that changed the political process?
Oh, it definitely has, because it restricts the ability of the legislature and the governor to make their budgets. So we voters we don't like what the legislature's done, so we pass something by initiative that mandates spending or tax changes or whatever, and that makes it more difficult for the legislature to actually act, and so we get angry at the legislature, and we are in what we call the cycle of contempt, spiraling downward, limiting the legislature's discretion and then blaming them for not acting.
Yeah, the money spent on propositions is getting to be quite large. In the November 2012 elections, over $375 million was spent on the 11 propositions for and against, most by wealthy individuals and special interests. So is Hiram Johnson, the person who established the initiative proposition process 100 years ago to fight special interests, is he rolling over in his grave?
Well, in part, but it's important to remember that even Hiram Johnson had big-moneyed millionaires supporting him when he put things on the ballot. That it's grown as California has in scope and scale, the amount of money, but it's been part of our process forever. And unfortunately, under the Supreme Court rulings about money and in politics, there's not a lot we can do to keep money from playing a major role. On the private side, what we could do is put some public money in and have try to change the initiative process in ways that make it more deliberative so voters have other sources of information.
Well, one of the things you talk about in your book is a greater emphasis on referendums as opposed to initiatives and propositions. Why do you support greater use of referendums? And what's the difference between an initiative and a proposition versus a referendum?
Well, in an initiative, somebody writes a law, gets signatures and proposes a law, takes on the role of lawmaking. In the referendum process, voters pass judgment on laws that the legislature has already passed. So it's more of a conversation, and the initiative is a very blunt tool.
Is a referendum a veto on what the legislature has done?
It's a veto or an approval of what it can done. And in most places outside the United States, the referendum is the more commonly used of the direct democracy processes. It's, a legislative body tries something, the people say, that's not right, they try it again, people, it goes back and forth. There's a discussion, a conversation. And instead, we use the blunt tool of the initiative much, much more.
What are the 2 or 3 key changes you think need to be made to the initiative process to make it better?
Well, I think first making it more flexible on the front end and the back end, let it be used as a lever in negotiation with the legislature, and then have laws passed by initiative be subject to change as conditions change. Right now, we're governed by ghosts many times.
Okay, well, when we come back, we'll discuss other reforms to the political process that may make California government more responsive, effective, and efficient. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're discussing what can be done to improve California government with Mark Paul, co-author of California Crackup, How Reform Broke the Golden State and How We Can Fix It. Well, over $500 million was spent on California elections in 2012, most of it from wealthy donors, special interests, and outside interests. What about money in politics? Do we need campaign finance reform? What about increased transparency? Or is there something else? Or all of the above?
Well, we have in California lots of transparency about where donations to individual candidates come from. And there are not many opportunities to do campaign finance reform under the Supreme Court decisions that we now have. Our current Supreme Court is very protective, regards money as being synonymous with speech, and so there are limits on what we can do. Changing the legislature in the ways we talked about previously, have smaller districts, would make a big difference so that people could campaign face to face rather than doing it the way they do it now with television and direct mail and the like.
What about transparency? There was a big issue in the November election, about $11 million that came in at the last minute, and nobody could seem to trace. I think they still haven't found out who exactly that money came from.
That's right, and under the law, they were required to disclose the groups it came from, but under the federal law, we don't know who the donors to those groups are because of the Supreme Court Citizens United decision and the like. So some of this will take action by probably at the national level, a constitutional amendment of some kind to be able to deal with. But we could have smaller districts, for instance, in California, that would make money less important.
Okay, talking about special interests, there's special interest corporations have interests, unions, public employee unions have interests. There's been talk about, curbing the power of special interests. But if you curb the power of one, which I think what Prop 32 was all about in the last election, you then increase the power of the opposition. So how do you create a level playing field when you're dealing with special interests?
Well, one of the ways you do it, and that we don't recognize, is that we in California have gone far in the direction of reducing the power of political parties. And political parties around the world and through our history have played important roles of aggregating groups and forcing special interests together in larger coalitions in which they have to compromise with each other. In politics, if you reduce the power of parties, as we have in California, something else fills the vacuum. And what's filled the vacuum in California politics and American politics are narrow special interest groups. We would be better off if we moved our system back more in the direction of parties playing a larger role than trial lawyers or corporations or public employee unions.
You've also seen an increase in the number of declined to state or independent voters, kind of moving away from party affiliation. That's something also that's happening in California.
That people are registering decline to state, but they're still acting like partisans. There's really no reason now under our electoral system, since we don't have primary elections for party nominations anymore, there's really no reason for anybody to register with a particular party.
Let me ask you about supermajorities, and sometimes they're required to do things like pass taxes. You say in your book that, quote, supermajorities are dangerous, unquote. It's pretty strong language. You basically argue that supermajorities grant tremendous power to a few at the expense of majority rule. Are they? But others would say they're necessary as a check on overreach.
Well, we in California and in all the American systems, of systems of checks and balances we have between executive, judicial, and legislative, have lots of checks. And so what the 2/3 does is it creates a check within a check, within the legislature. The language you described about supermajorities being dangerous is not our language. That's James Madison's language. At the time when they wrote the U.S. Constitution, where they were explaining why it is that they did not have supermajorities, which the Articles of Confederation did, which paralyzed the country.
Well, let me ask you another issue about accountability, and that is all these constitutional officers we have in California: lieutenant governor, attorney general, superintendent of instruction. I won't list all of them. No. But what can be done to clean up that process and make those officers more accountable to the citizens?
Well, what we would do is have them, all of them except for Secretary of State, cease to be elective offices. We don't elect the U.S. Attorney General or the Secretary of Defense or any of the rest of it. There's the President is accountable for the actions of the Attorney General or the Secretary of Defense. It ought to be the same way in California. We spread out responsibility in so many different hands, the voters can't really keep track. I mean, most voters don't know what a controller or a treasurer does. I used to be deputy treasurer of California. I suspect most people, when I tell them that, they nod their head, but have no idea what I did.
It sounds very important.
It sounded very important, yes.
Well, I want to end with this. In your book, you state that, quote, only a constitutional convention or constitutional revision enacted by the legislature can produce the scope of government's reform that is necessary, unquote. But then you also say, quote, the history of California government and constitution is that changes are made often rapidly and haphazardly, occasioned by spasms of popular anger at the status quo, unquote. So how would a new constitution produce any different result, and how would you ensure that special interests wouldn't capture any constitutional convention?
Well, there's never a guarantee that there can't be capture. I mean, but what we in California have never done is sit down and try to look at all the pieces of our system together, how they interact with each other, and particularly how they interact with the kind of state we are, which was big, rambunctious, where we don't pay a lot of attention to government. Californians are complex people. Complex and busy people need a simpler government. So what we need is what we've never had in California, which is a real founding moment when we fit government and the pieces to who we are as a people.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Mark Paul, co-author of California Crackup, how reform broke the Golden State and how we can fix it, for joining us. If you want to stay up to date with state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
California government borders on dysfunctional. The paralysis of the legislature, the reliance on initiatives to govern, and the difficulty of changing even minor things, let alone fundamental issues, are all symptoms of a system that is broken. Most people can agree on that, and it is not a partisan issue. California didn't get this way because of the actions of a single party or interest group or voting bloc. Everybody pitched in on digging this hole. It will take some heavy lifting from everybody to dig out. You've been listening to Mark Paul, one of the co-authors of California Crackup and an advocate of government reform, talk about some proposals to make California's government work again. Paul and his co-author, Joe Matthews, presented a number of strategies for fixing California government: electing lawmakers from multi-representative districts, converting to a one-house legislature, reforming the initiative process, and changing the rules for passing budgets and raising taxes. Many other proposals make sense, but their overriding message is that one or two reforms won't fix things very much. The system will merely adjust and be just as dysfunctional. Ironically, reform is also the culprit. The subtitle of Paul's book is How Reform Broke the Golden State and How We Can Fix It. It explained that well-intentioned reform often led to unintended consequences. In trying to compensate with more fixes, state government boxed itself into traps from which it couldn't escape. We are held hostage by our own good intentions. The changes proposed by Paul and Matthews intend to return California to a system in which things get done, systems work, and they are things that most people want. In most cases, it comes down to common sense and being responsive to the needs of people, not interest groups or institutions, and certainly not government itself. And it has to have the vision of the big picture and not one little fix. Senator Ken Maddy built a reputation as a lawmaker who saw a pragmatic need to get things done. He recognized that people don't care about party labels or reputation. They wanted results, and he was willing to work across party lines to get results. One of the reasons California is so dysfunctional is that so-called reforms, such as term limits, redistricting, and two-thirds majority requirements for raising taxes, have created a system in which lawmakers care more about their party than about those they serve. The most meaningful reform that could take place in California government would be if every office holder adhered to the simple principles of government of, for, and by the people. Any other reform would just put California in another fix.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.